Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something super fascinating, the actual mechanics of how India's borders are legally drawn, redrawn, and settled. We're going to be treating the Constitution not just as some old static document, but as a living, breathing operating manual for a truly living map, making sense of the complex legal concepts governing India's territory. Let's get started.
Okay, here's our game plan for today. We'll start with the constitutional framework, move on to redrawing internal boundaries, take a close look at the Jammu and Kashmir case, then discuss ceding Indian territory, and finally wrap up with settling border disputes.
All right, Part 1, the constitutional framework.
So, looking at Article 1, notice the explicit mention of acquired territories. The key takeaway here: India's map wasn't just frozen in time in 1950. It actually has built-in rules for bringing in new lands under international law. But there's a catch. Like we saw in the 1963 Mazdan Sahib case with Pondicherry, even if India practically controls an area administratively, making it legally part of the country requires formal treaty ratification. It's got to be by the book.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Articles 2, 3, and 4 give Parliament just immense power over the country's internal map. Acting on the president's recommendation, they can literally reshape borders, merge territories, or admit completely new states. And the craziest part? They can pull off these massive changes with just simple legislation. Yep, they can totally bypass the super rigid, drawn-out process of a formal constitutional amendment.
Moving right along to Section 2, redrawing internal boundaries.
So you might be logically wondering, in a union of states, couldn't a state just step in and block its own division or reorganization? Do they actually have veto power over their own borders? Well, let's look at how the Supreme Court handled this exact constitutional stress test. The 1960 case, Babulal Purate versus State of Bombay, gives us an incredibly clear answer. The Supreme Court said that while the president does have to ask the affected state legislature for its opinion on a reorganization bill, those views are strictly recommendatory. It's basically just a suggestion. Unlike some rigid federal systems out there, India's internal borders are highly flexible. If Parliament hears the state out, but then decides to modify the bill anyway, they don't need to go back and ask for fresh approval. At the end of the day, the map is firmly in Parliament's hands.
But hold on. Parliament's power isn't totally limitless. As we saw during the Punjab reorganization in the 1967 Mongol Singh case, the Supreme Court drew a line. They clarified that any newly formed state still has to fit the democratic blueprint envisioned by the Constitution. You can't just randomly draw lines on a map and call it a day. The new entity actually needs functioning, effective legislative, executive, and judicial organs to be legitimate.
Okay, on to Section 3, the Jammu and Kashmir case.
Let's untangle the timeline here. It shows the whole procedural journey, starting with the imposition of governor's rule back in June 2018. Then, the monumental shift in August 2019 when the state was bifurcated into two separate union territories, Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir, through the Reorganization Act. And finally, after immense legal scrutiny, the Supreme Court officially validated this whole process in December 2023.
So how exactly did they achieve this legally? Well, it all came down to specific executive orders, namely CO 272 and 273. The president used these powers to first tweak the interpretation clause, Article 367, so that references to the dissolved Constituent Assembly were instead read as the Legislative Assembly. After that clever pivot, a declaration was made rendering Article 370 inoperative. This essentially applied the entire Indian Constitution to Jammu and Kashmir, effectively bypassing the dissolved state assembly altogether.
Naturally, this was heavily challenged, but a full bench of the Supreme Court took a really close look at these steps and impartially validated the culmination of this integration process. The court was crystal clear. Article 370 was always enacted as a transitional, temporary provision, and critically, they stated that Jammu and Kashmir did not hold any internal sovereignty separate from India.
On top of that, the court upheld the actual Reorganization Act that split the state. And this is where it ties beautifully back to our earlier point about the 1960 Babulal Purate case. Cementing Parliament's massive authority under Article 3, the court confirmed that during President's rule, Parliament can totally step in and validly exercise the powers of the state legislature, basically reiterating that a state's views on reorganization are ultimately just recommendations.
All right, pivoting now to Section 4, ceding Indian territory.
This brings us to a massive, really intriguing question. If Parliament can just redraw internal lines with a simple piece of legislation, could they just hand over sovereign land to a neighboring country with that exact same ease? I mean, especially when the original text of the Constitution literally has no explicit provision for ceding territory? What happens then?
To understand this, just look at the sheer chaos of the Cooch Behar enclaves along the border with Bangladesh. The geography here was just mind-boggling. We're talking about places where you literally had an enclave, inside another enclave. It was like a giant impossible puzzle. Resolving this was an absolute geographic necessity for the citizens who were practically trapped in these fragmented pockets. This desperate need led to the famous 1974 agreement to exchange enclaves. But how do you actually execute that legally? Well, a legal roadmap for this was actually laid out way back in the 1962 Berubari Union case. The Supreme Court set down some incredibly strict rules. First off, they acknowledged that yes, the power to cede territory is just an inherent attribute of being a sovereign nation. However, and this is a huge however, unlike tweaking internal borders, a simple law under Article 3 is absolutely not going to cut it. Giving away territory to a foreign power explicitly requires the heavy machinery of a formal constitutional amendment under Article 368. So, sticking strictly to those constitutional steps, the 119th Amendment in 2015 finally validated the enclave exchange with Bangladesh. When the dust finally settled and the maps were redrawn, India saw a net loss of about 40 square kilometers of territory. To put that into perspective, it's a relatively tiny slice of land, but handing it over legally and permanently settled one of the most ridiculously complex borders in the entire world. And finally, we arrive at Section 5, Settling Border Disputes.
Now, we really have to distinguish between giving away undisputed land and just settling a blurry dispute. Take the incredibly fluid geography of the Sur Creek boundary line between India's Kutch region and Pakistan's Sindh province. We're talking about shifting marshlands that are literally underwater for months at a time, making the actual boundary insanely ill-defined. This ambiguity actually sparked an armed conflict back in 1965, and it took a 1968 International Tribunal Award to finally figure out and demarcate the true boundary line.
And right here is the absolute crucial legal distinction. Cession, which is actively giving away undisputed recognized territory, demands a full-blown constitutional amendment, like we saw in the Berubari case. But simply settling a disputed, ill-defined boundary, the law views that as merely an executive action. No constitutional amendment is needed whatsoever. Why? Because legally, you aren't actually losing territory, you're just officially discovering and drawing a line where your real territory ends.
This whole principle was totally cemented in the 1969 Magam-Bai Ishwar-Bai Patel case. The Supreme Court ruled that implementing that Rann of Kutch Tribunal Award was literally just boundary demarcation. They upheld the executive's power to act, basically via a simple exchange of letters to implement a treaty, without needing a huge Article 368 amendment. The logic was rock solid. No recognized, undisputed Indian land was actually being given away.
Okay, let's bring this all together. If there's one big thing you should take away from this explainer, it's that the Constitution provides a highly adaptable, really flexible framework internally. Parliament has immense power to just draw and redraw those state lines. But externally, it throws up robust, heavy legal safeguards. Giving away undisputed land demands a strict constitutional amendment, whereas simply settling a hazy, disputed border remains a totally valid, practical executive action.